One claims it's the company's only chance for survival.
Atari has filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. The 31-year-old
AWA presents the difference. Kodak is filing for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection.
What's up, guys? My name is Jake, and welcome to the 32nd episode of Bankrupt. Canada has had major department stores come and go for centuries, much like many other nations and markets. It's the life cycle of retail, and it's not always forgiving, even to the most loved and cherished brands. The Hudson Bay Company seemed to be an exemption from that, though, surviving over 350 years, becoming North America's oldest retailer, and even predating the very country it had come to iconically represent. But that incredible legacy all came crashing down as the company announced they would be shutting down permanently. Today, let's take a look at this iconic brand and how after 3 centuries, they would ultimately declare bankruptcy. This video is sponsored by Opera. Try my favorite new and improved modern web browser, Opera One R2 today by clicking my special link in the description below. The Hudson Bay Company's lineage isn't like other big box retail stores in North America, which may have started in the early 1920s or even the late 19th century. No, Hudson Bay can be traced all the way back to 1670. It was founded by 2 French explorers and financed by the British. The 2 explorers discovered where best to hunt beavers for their warm and malleable pelts, mainly around the Hudson Bay drainage basin. At the time, these pelts sold for high prices in England, and this newly incorporated company, appropriately called the Hudson Bay Company, was essentially given a monopoly of territory, around 40% of what is now known as Canada today, an area called Rupert's Land. The company, which would later employ around 500 Europeans, would set up small trading posts and hunt beavers through the various streams which led into the basin. Due to a number of factors like foreign diseases ravaging the indigenous tribes of the area, the company would ultimately push west. And fast forward to the late 1700s, when the United States of America had conquering aspirations of British North America, the British laid claims to the area, presenting the Hudson's Bay Company as one of its permanent fixtures. Obviously, there is so much more history during this time, and it's difficult to even give the highlights, so I'll link a few places in the description for further reading on the early years. But it is hard to articulate just how important this company was, not only for the Europeans working on the fur trades and the connections the company made with the indigenous tribes all over the northern continent, but the very creation of Canada itself. By the mid-1800s, the Hudson's Bay Company, or HBC, had their monopoly come to an end. The deed they had owned for large swaths of land was transferred to the newly formed nation of Canada. Their business, based around the fur trades, was thrown into serious peril, and to better diversify, the company began leaning into their physical trading post locations, and began setting up stores that were more consumer-facing. These new stores would be constructed along major rivers and settlements, which would eventually become major Canadian cities. In just a few short years, Hudson's Bay Company was growing, and so were their aspirations. In 1881, they had opened a large, flagship, multi-story retail store in downtown Winnipeg. A collection of not only the products they knew best, but also groceries, hardware, and dry goods. Hudson's Bay was now becoming a major retail brand. By the early 20th century, the company began expanding this downtown large format store concept to other major Canadian cities, building elegant and grand department stores in each, from Vancouver to Saskatoon. While the First World War would slow down progress, both with opening new locations and renovating existing ones, HBC would continue to diversify following the war. They would get into the oil and gas sector, and following the Russian Civil War, they would even set up a very brief presence in the Siberian territory. Meanwhile, back in Canada, the company continued to expand their presence, and their downtown department stores became known as vast, high-end shopping experiences, with their stately buildings containing everything you might need, from a restaurant and Chinese rugs, to flowers, paints, and of course, the furs. By the 1960s, the retailer began expanding their presence across the country once again, opening stores in Ontario and acquiring a Montreal-based retailer to absorb their locations in Quebec. This was also around the same time when their stores began adopting the name The Bay. Even by the 1970s, HBC was actually still technically a UK company, with their head offices still in London from all those years back. By the time of their 300th year anniversary, they would now re-register as a Canadian corporation and move their offices to Winnipeg and eventually Toronto. Hudson's Bay was now formally a true Canadian retailer. Around this time, they would also expand to the Maritimes and Eastern Canada. And just like retailers had been doing in the United States, they would also adopt and open new locations in the big box store format. While the company was still running its oil business, as well as a real estate arm, Hudson's Bay was about to go on another buying spree to grow their retail empire to one unrivaled across the country. In 1978, Hudson's Bay would acquire both the Simpsons department store brand, a century-old retailer, as well as the iconic discount brand Zellers. Hudson's Bay would also acquire over 33% in the hugely popular Simpsons Sears brand, the Canadian arm of Sears Roebuck. With these brands now under HBC's ownership, their sales skyrocketed to nearly $1.9 billion by the end of that year. Adjusted for inflation, that's over $8.5 billion today. A truly enormous retailer. With over 45,000 employees across all of their various business arms, the company continued to grow through the 1980s, a prominent retail giant of Canada. A few years later, the company would spend the money to acquire the remaining shares to make their investments in Simpsons and Zellers whole. This is all while they also acquired the Towers discount department store chain, eventually merging it into Zellers. By the early 1990s, this brought their total store count across all of their brands to around 485, with the Simpsons brand now being phased out in favor of the Bay. In total, by 1992, HBC's combined brands accounted for 7.5% of retail sales in all of Canada. While Zellers and their discount arm brought in most of the cash for the company, the Bay was also a massive and hugely successful brand, but not one without competition. Simpson Sears had now rebranded simply to Sears Canada by this point, and largely attacked a similar market to the Bay, as did another legacy department store brand, Eaton's. In 1994, Walmart had also entered the Canadian market, now a direct competitor to HBC's discount chains. To better compete and grow market share in that segment, the company would acquire the Canadian operations of the struggling Kmart chain in 1998, rebranding nearly all of them to Zellers. Despite all of this competition though, HBC and the Bay were still seeing significant year-over-year growth, and by the millennium, they had posted incredible sales of over $7.5 billion and profit of over $125 million. These years were enormously successful for the company, and Canadians all over would make special trips out to the Bay for all types of goods. From the wide assortment of apparel choices, often across multi-levels, to the accessories and home goods. The Bay was truly a staple, an icon of Canadian retail, one which grew to be loved by many. As a kid growing up in Canada, I certainly remember going to the Bay. In fact, I remember going to their restaurants, which was such a unique feature for a department store. The Bay itself, though, continued to stay pretty subdued with their mainline department store presence. Unlike Sears Canada, which had expanded up to 140 locations, the Bay only had around 98. Many of them, though, continuing to be staples of the classic downtown department store experience, or big box locations, often found within shopping malls. While it was a strong start to the early 2000s, the reality of the intensifying retail market was beginning to become clear for HBC. And that reality wasn't looking as bright as it may have originally seemed. The growth of Walmart in Canada began to harshly chip away at Hudson Bay's entire business, mainly their Zellers discount brand, which started to fall behind and let the American retail giant gain more market share. As a result, both sales and net earnings for the company fell in 2003, 2004, and 2005. This angered Jerry Zucker, a South Carolina businessman who nearly owned a quarter stake in the company. He demanded change, and following these disappointing quarters and with a plan of action to help turn the brand around, in 2006 he acquired the controlling shares of the company for around $1.1 billion. He would then invest in the company's brands to upgrade the chain and freshen up merchandise. The turnaround, however, only went so far, and while the company continued to slide in sales, Zucker would abruptly pass away in 2008. His wife would briefly take the reins at the company, but would ultimately opt to sell it to another new corporate entity. New York-based NRDC Equity Partners, a private equity firm, would ultimately be the winning bidder, acquiring the Hudson Bay Company for an undisclosed but a speculated slightly higher price of $1.1 billion. The effort was led by a man named Richard Baker, who following the acquisition became the company's governor and chairman. He too also had aspirations of turning HBC around, and while he and his firm were mostly experienced in real estate investments, they had kind of done this before with Lord & Taylor. The idea was to update the existing brands and turn the Bay into more of a high-end entity with a focus on younger consumers. While this was all well and good, in true private equity fashion, this would also come with a cut of 1,000 jobs and a downsizing effort to save over $150 million by 2010. But the big moves didn't stop there. Despite Zellers being a profit center for HBC, the company would ultimately enter in an agreement with the American retailer Target to sell the Zellers brand to them for around $1.8 billion. This was done as a strategy for Target to essentially enter the Canadian markets and essentially take over all of the Zellers real estates, which infamously went very, very wrong. It went so wrong, in fact, that I've covered the whole debacle on my channel a few times in the past, and the scars of that failure can still be seen all over Canada today. Regardless, Zellers was now out of the picture, and if anything, Hudson's Bay had now just sold their discount retail arm to a potential competitor, all while Walmart continued to eat away at their market share. By 2012, NRDC Equity had decided to restructure the company, first with bundling Lord & Taylor in with the Bay, having HBC pledge over $400 million to make the acquisition, while also bringing the Hudson's Bay Company back to the stock market. After an IPO in 2012, earning them around $2 billion, it was also announced that the very brand itself would be changing. The Bay was becoming a tired-looking logo, largely unchanged from the 1960s, so the name was changed back to simply Hudson's Bay. Even though the company was made up of two of North America's oldest retailers, 2013 was also the same year in which HBC would acquire Saks Incorporated, the owner of the high-end department store retailer Saks Fifth Avenue. They completed the deal for $2.9 billion, mainly with senior secured loans put against the company. This now meant that across their 320 combined retail locations, many of them would actually operate outside of Canada. However, Hudson's Bay as a retail brand was recovering a bit, seeing a rise in digital sales as well as an increase in sales per square foot. Things were actually looking good for the brand, and while there were still plenty of challenging issues ahead, the corporate outlook seemed to be pretty positive. 2016 was a big year for the company. Aside from acquiring a digital retail site for $250 million, the company also expanded the Hudson's Bay brand outside of Canada for the first time, opening some truly beautiful stores in the Netherlands. Many of them were modern interpretations of the flagship downtown stores in Canada, while also incorporating higher-end retail concepts like cafes and restaurants. But all of this growth and positive outlook wasn't really reflecting in their finances. Despite a truly colossal $14.5 billion in sales, the company as a whole would post a net loss of around $516 million. It turns out that the aggressive European expansion was actually a bad decision, and after hundreds of millions were lost, all Dutch Hudson Bay locations were shuttered just a few years later. Meanwhile, Hudson's Bay had announced over 2,000 layoffs, along with their CEO resigning in 2017. Not good. For the next 2 years, HBC would continue to lose money, over $580 million in 2018 and another $542 million in 2019. It seemed like the brand was on a slippery downward slope, and all of these expensive acquisitions and expansion plans had largely dragged down the otherwise pretty stable brand. In an effort to change things up on the corporate side, a group of investors were wrangled up, including various new foreign private equity interests, as well as long-standing chairman Richard Baker, who had then announced their intentions to restructure the brand. With this new group of private equity investors, they wanted to acquire the controlling shares of the company and take it private once again. And while a Canadian investment firm did try and block the deal, Baker would ultimately get his way, and once again, Hudson's Bay Company was taken off the stock market. Through the rest of 2019, it seemed like the new strategy was to cut off excess and streamline the company. Lord & Taylor was sold off at a $120 million loss, while that online retail company they purchased for $250 million was offloaded for an undisclosed amount, as were their German department store brands. The Hudson Bay Company, as a corporate structure, now only consisted of their flagship namesake brand and Saks. It was a massive streamlining from where they were just a few years prior. Since they were now private, the company didn't have to disclose financial data. So we don't really know how they were doing since 2019. But I think it is safe to assume that things weren't great, especially following what was about to happen. Of course, all of their retail operations took a pretty big hit during the pandemic and the subsequent lockdown efforts across Canada and the United States. The sudden halt in day-to-day physical shoppers presumably put a huge dent in the company's overall profits, and clearly they were feeling the financial effects. By 2021, they began a long string of taking out mortgages on key real estate properties, which was already on top of a $150 million loan they had taken from yet another American private equity firm. A year later, they would take out yet another mortgage with a major Canadian bank for 2 of their downtown locations, collectively worth around $300 million. While the company was seemingly desperate for cash, they were also planning to bring another iconic retail brand back from the dead, Zellers. In late 2022, and with a decent amount of hype, Hudson's Bay announced they would be resurrecting the former discount department store brand and opening 25 new locations. Seemingly the perfect brand to bring back for the ever-present price-conscious consumer. In reality, though, it turned out that these new Zellers locations would be a store within a store concept, popping up in the corner of a few Hudson Bay locations. Honestly, they were pretty sad and seemingly not all that popular. The same could honestly be said for Hudson's Bay as a whole by this point. Gone were the days of excited, loyal, and enthusiastic shoppers inside an equally enticing store. Anyone who's walked into a store over the last decade or so was often met with a department store both inside and out that was totally out of date. Through the making of this video, and just by my own experiences in the past, I've been in plenty of Hudson Bay locations, and just about all of them are bland, outdated stores which are very rough around the edges. If you just walk around a store, you'll not only notice a lack of shoppers, but you'll see stained, ripped carpets, old off-white tiling, discolored drop ceiling panels, an exterior with peeling paint, and just an overall rundown look. Clearly, there were significant budget issues present here. Many of the multi-story locations had their escalators turned off, likely in order to save money on electricity and maintenance. This was while their in-store displays were dismal. I didn't get a great shot of it, but one day when I visited, they had staged these empty water jugs all over the store as some sort of cheap environmental outdoorsy style display or something. What? This was all amongst inventory of tired, unexciting brands, especially for younger shoppers. Much of it is not very competitive with value either, while other categories like home goods all just felt like overpriced junk that you would see drop-shipped on Amazon. The home furnishings area had cheap, out-of-style furniture for moderately high prices. That's all while there are multiple other retailers in Canada where you can get equivalent quality for way cheaper. And that kind of applied to many of the product categories at a Hudson's Bay store. So the whole time I was there, I just thought to myself, why would anyone shop here? Really, all of this mirrored the same issues that the US department stores like JCPenney and especially Sears had faced. In fact, the differences between Hudson's Bay and Sears aesthetically towards the end are pretty hard to discern, which I should point out is a very bad thing. In fact, HBC management continued to watch both Sears Canada and Sears Roebuck in the States fold under their failing brand strategy. And Hudson's Bay, looking very similar to what Sears used to be, responded by opening up a Zellers pop-up. They did basically nothing else, at least to the consumer side of things. By 2023, Hudson's Bay would announce a series of corporate layoffs, just as they had shuttered one of their downtown Toronto locations. HBC would also sell off and take out loans for more of their real estate to raise money and pay suppliers, a clear indication that things may have been getting desperate. From the outside, it seemed like corporate leadership was preparing the lifeboat. Despite the company as a whole treading water, surprisingly in July of 2024, Hudson's Bay Company announced they would be acquiring the American department store chain Neiman Marcus for around $2.65 billion USD. Despite technically being acquired by Hudson's Bay, it was announced that this acquisition would be spun off in a new private corporate entity called Saks Global, which by the name implies would also include the separation of Saks Fifth Avenue. HBC would continue to operate Saks stores in Canada, but only as an operator through a licensing deal. This whole Neiman Marcus acquisition was pretty odd considering the financial trouble they were clearly in, and I was pretty confused as to why they would do this. So I spoke with Doug Stevens, the founder of the retail advisory firm called Retail Profit.
I wrote an article for the Business of Fashion that called that move out as kind of the final piece of financial engineering. It was essentially a move aimed at isolating the company so that its liquidation could be done in isolation and not have any impact or any residual implications for the Saks Global Group. Business of Fashion took the extra measure of actually getting in touch with NRDC to actually question them on that and say, is this a valid opinion? Or, are you prepared to push back on that? Was there another reason for it? And they had no comment on that. So we can assume that that was indeed the motivation.
Hudson's Bay Company had now been spun off as its own lone corporate entity, and their future outlook was not looking good. As the company failed to pay some mall landlords, it seemed as though time was up for the brand. With not enough liquid cash to make payments to suppliers, on March 7th, 2025, the Hudson's Bay Company announced they had filed for CCAA creditor protection, essentially Canada's version of Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The filing showed that the Bay had around $3 million in cash on hand, while they still owed tens of millions to suppliers. In fact, the entire company nearly owed $1 billion in debt. By the end of the month, and after various court proposals and little interest to supply cash to keep the retailer going, the decision was made to liquidate everything apart from 6 key stores. Those 6 locations, mainly in Ontario, were some of their most valuable and high-trafficked areas, like their prime location in downtown Toronto. However, by April, the court deemed the probability of finding a buyer to operate those 6 locations as too risky, and the decision was then made to liquidate them anyways, essentially shutting down the entire Hudson's Bay Company and selling off everything. So by March 24th, Hudson Bay stores across Canada began their liquidation sales, slowly selling off everything at all 80 locations. As stores continued to close slowly and shut down, planning to conclude in June, the corporate side was also liquidating. HBC planned to auction off their rare company artifacts, including the 1670 Royal Charter, a document very important to Canadian history and something worth quite a bit of money, though many correctly argue that it should be donated for public viewing. Meanwhile, the branding and the rights to sell some of their exclusive products, like the iconic striped blankets, were also put up for bidding. That apparently garnering quite a bit of interest, including a bid from domestic retailer Canadian Tire. They would actually acquire the brand and the rights to sell the striped blankets in May for around $30 million. So it seems that, at least in name only, the brand will live on. No matter what though, Hudson's Bay, as it once was, is now over.
There was an Instagram message that was put out, and it was kind of like, they were saying, hey, thanks for the great weekend sale event, Canada. But it was, hey, thanks for the last 350 years, Canada. See you later. If somebody had sat down and said, how can we add insult to injury here? Any ideas? That would be the one. So yeah, it was kind of hard to take.
Look, this story is a complex one, and there is a lot to consider when looking at their massive history as a whole. Through its whole life, it has survived challenge after challenge, proving to be one of the most resilient companies, certainly retailers, in North America. Its success through this time clearly made it a valuable asset, obviously worthy of an acquisition. But despite its own merits as a retailer, it seems as though the portfolio of valuable real estate was the real interest to Richard Baker and his private equity firm, which again specialized in real estate. Once Hudson's Bay was acquired, it was no longer a Canadian entity. It was now an investment vehicle for American investors who didn't have a whole lot of experience with department store retail long term. Even if they wanted to claim that Lord & Taylor was their success story, did it really turn out to be? Clearly their interest level in the company varied over time, as they seemed to be more interested in what the brand could do for them. They are a private equity investment firm after all, which needless to say, doesn't have a great track record with buying up legacy retail brands. The needless expansion and acquisitions only loaded the company with debt and failed ambition. By the time the pandemic hit, Hudson's Bay was already facing stiff competition from online retailers, and as many pointed out, it had been grossly underinvested. And it's not like department store concepts don't work in Canada, because they actually do. Many brands like Uniqlo do a tremendous job at targeting specific consumers, while the Quebec-born Simon's department store has seen great success and is even expanding right now by staying modern and curating a relevant product selection housed in nice stores. As analysts have pointed out during this whole debacle, consumers still like going to department stores, they just don't like going to department stores from 2006. And that's exactly what the modern Hudson's Bay department stores felt like. And in many fundamental ways, they were still a 2006 retailer. In my opinion, their private equity owners just didn't do remotely enough. Whether it was because they didn't know what they were doing, or how to run a department store chain, or because they were simply more interested in squeezing every bit of value out of the company as possible, without having to put anything back in. And really, I don't think that harsh take is really all that out of pocket, as many argue that's exactly what private equity firms do. I also had to ask Doug on how he's reflected with HBC and their private equity owners.
I feel that had Richard Baker been just a guy that used his own money, out of pocket, bought a business, didn't know anything about how to run it, ran it into the ground, wound up going bankrupt, I'd say, well, that's life, right? But the model itself encourages what has happened. The business incentive is no different whether the business survives or dies. And in some cases, it may even be better from a financial payoff if it dies. You know, when you're using 80% of, other people's money to buy a business and then collecting a management fee from both sides as the acquisition actually withers, and then you get to just sort of walk away from the wreckage only to do it again and again and again, then I think there's something wrong with that. That's just not a healthy form of capitalism. And, there are 9,400 lives in Canada that are now affected by that model.
There's a lot of blame to be thrown around here, and the complete negligence and even ignorance from the owners is also just infuriating. Back in early 2023, the company's chairman, Richard Baker, said that, quote, "The Hudson's Bay Company is at the greatest value and financial strength it has been since 1670. He also said that, quote, "I plan on being the governor of the Hudson's Bay Company until the day they put me in the ground." In the end, this truly is a tragic story. For me, this might actually be the most angry and sad I've ever been while covering a brand in the series. This is a company which has been around for 355 years. That's 3.5 centuries of weathering nearly every type of adverse world event you can think of. Which really puts into perspective how ridiculous it is that it only took just a few years to bring it all down. One of the most iconic Canadian companies brought down, mind you, by a foreign investment firm. So of course this is all extremely frustrating and pretty sad. But what's even more disappointing is what the brand could have been. If they had gotten the investment they desperately needed to make their stores a pleasant place to be, and focus not only on the iconic striped heritage items, but also on modern apparel and accessories that made other stores like Simon's so successful, then I think they would have had a seriously real shot. There needed to be a vision that leveraged such potential held within the company's heritage and brand identity. Especially given this, let's say, interesting time in history where more Canadians are looking for leaders in Canadian retail more than ever before. The pivot they needed was right there. Yet, ironically, it was taken away by US investors, with seemingly no respect for the very history and Canadian influence that allowed this company to withstand the test of time. But, of course, instead of all of that, this iconic brand, which first raised their HBC flag over 3 centuries ago, will now close as a very different company for the final time. This video was particularly difficult to research, since not only was there so much information about the brand, but its history has been covered by so many various outlets. That's why I'm really excited about this video's sponsor, Opera. I've talked about them before over on my travel channel, and with a host of really useful features, I'm even more excited about what has been added. Beyond new themes, a way for you to customize the UI of your browsing experience from the colors, sounds, and backgrounds, there's also a new built-in floating music player. You can control music from 7 different streaming services without switching tabs, and even detach it and move it outside the browser. But what I especially love are the enhancements made to the organization and tab management. Split screen allows you to have 2 different tabs open on the same screen without having to open another window. This is incredibly useful for me for writing scripts while also fact-checking. Thanks to tab islands, I can cleverly group tabs based on context to stay organized and save space. This is while tab traces lets you easily find tabs which you have just visited, the darker the underscore displaying the most recent tab you visited. This is all on top of the usual snappy modern experience, along with the many other built-in features that I really love. So if you want to try it out completely for free, you can click the link in the description below. Anyway guys, my name is Jake, and thank you very much for watching.
We're coast to coast, shore to shore. We've got what you're looking for. All the style of today. That's why you